Hello everyone and welcome back to my Magic the Gathering Commander Deck List Reviews. So this is a series where I go through either my own personal Commander decks or those submitted by users and break them down to their core mechanics. I'll talk about the Commander, what the deck's generally trying to do, give my critiques, and wrap it all up with my feedback at the end. If you want to get your own deck list reviewed, make sure to head to the top link in the description to get it personally reviewed by me. With all that out of the way, let's get into today's episode. So today we are talking about one of the new Edge of Eternity's commander, one of the more memey, sort of cool, different commanders I saw from the set with Ragost, Deft Gastronaut. So he is a Boros 2/2 lobster citizen and says artifacts you control are foods in addition to their other types and have the food text of pay 2 mana, tap it, sacrifice this artifact, you gain 3 life. He also has the ability to pay 1 mana, tap, sacrifice a food, and it deals 3 damage to each opponent. And it says at the beginning of each end step, if you gain life this turn, untap Ragost. So there's obviously, just with the commander itself, a very, easy to see plan where you make a bunch of artifacts, whether they be food or not, crack those food either through their own means of gaining life, and then sacrifice him to the Ragost to deal damage. The life gain off of the food allows him to untap to deal more damage. There's sort of a theme with that there. I have seen with this commander, there's a lot of different archetypes you can kind of fit into it. Though I do have to say, Boros Food is not really anything we've seen too much of. Even that artifact text is kind of a unique one that gives us a lot of room to play with. The fact that we're making all artifacts food, it's sort of a slivers type thing where we can kind of just include a lot of stuff within the archetype that normally wouldn't, work with it. We've seen this with Ygritte, Eater of All in Bloomburrow, though that was Golgari, so we have completely different color pairing here, and we've kind of seen what that exactly does, and what kind of weird stuff we can kind of get away with having that text. So, this one specifically is really interesting because we are not in green, which is kind of the main color. Selesnya is the color pairing for food. So it's cool to have a little bit of a different archetype within this and kind of get a different, slice of the color pie to play with this mechanic. So here we've got I would say a bracket 3 deck is what I got it listed as. We've got our 3 game changers, and I think there are quite a few powerful things you can do with this deck. Of course, making artifacts food is a powerful enough mechanic for Ragost that there are infinite combos that can go with this, 2-3 card infinite combos that are very easy to do. I have not included any crazy combos in here. This isn't like a super synergy, tutor everything out turbo deck. That's more, of a bracket 4 thing, which you could definitely go with this deck. This is more of just kind of a go wide artifact good stuff. Not to the point where we're running, all of the artifact combos either, but just, hey, what value can we get out of our artifacts with the foods that kind of, in conjunction, kind of makes it a good synergy that you don't see in a lot of other decks. So firstly here, we've got our artifact token. So there's a lot of different ways to make artifacts in the game very easily. You can have, your non-token artifacts, but token artifacts are really nice because a lot of times you can make them en masse, so you can get a whole lot at once, or you can just make them repeatably, which is really nice because we're going to be cycling them over and over again, and so being able to create those tokens kind of just allows us to give us fuel for the fire. So first off, of course, we're running a deck that has a clue, food, or treasure, so we're going to want Academy Manufactor. So it's a 3 mana artifact creature. If you create a clue, food, or treasure, you can instead create one of each. So that's really nice anytime we're doing any of our food stuff, or, red has a lot of different ways to create treasure tokens, all these different things. We're getting all of them. So that's just, tripling basically all of the stuff that we're doing. Of course, for any of these types of decks, kind of an immediate include, it's extremely good for what we're doing. Same thing with Nuka-Cola Vending Machine, like even just this 2-card combo is a combo. With, when we sacrifice food, we're creating tap treasure tokens, so sort of just kind of another way to make sure that we're getting more value out of that. And of course, Nuka-Cola Vending Machine can also create foods. Like I said, this is probably the main way that we're going to be doing any sort of combo stuff within a deck like this, is the Nuka-Cola Vending Machine and Ragost. So Ragost, of course, because it is making all of our artifacts, not just non-token artifacts, all artifacts, including, our treasures and clues, food. Nuka-Cola Vending Machine basically, ends up having the text of whenever you sacrifice a food, you make a treasure food. So of course, with that, whenever you sack a food to make a food, that by itself is infinite. If you have any sort of sack outlet, you're able to do that as many times as you want, as long as you have mana, or, if you have like a KCI where you can just sacrifice artifacts for free, you're generating infinite mana off of that. And, if you do have, the combo of Nuka-Cola Vending Machine, Academy Manufactor, and Ragost, you're not just getting one token back, you're getting a whole bunch extra on that investment as well. So there's a lot of different things you can do with that. And there is one fairly convoluted combo in this deck that I am running, though it's like a 3-4 card combo that needs anything to work. More of just something I found while making the deck rather than something the deck was built around. We'll get to that later though. But yeah, these 2 cards, of course, I think are kind of our mainstays, especially Nuka-Cola Vending Machine. Just an insane card, does a lot for the deck, and probably one of our biggest ones. If you're running any tutors, this is usually what you're end up tutoring for, just because it does so much for what we're trying to do. Apothecary White from the Clue sort of weird mini alternate set within Murders That Call Out Manor. It says whenever you attack, you create a food token for each player being attacked. So, there's our food creation. Though I like her second activated ability a lot more for this even. You can pay a white, tap her to tap X untapped food you control and create X 1/1 white human creature token. So, I think that's just a really good way to, we have our Kenny Mini factor. It's an artifact. It is a food. We're not going to be attacking with this sort of stuff, or even if we're not creating food with our nuclear vending machine, using that sort of stuff to get a lot of extra value off of Apothecary White. And another thing you can definitely do with this deck if you want to, because all of our artifacts are food. It's not quite the Yeager text. Yeager just says creatures are food. So it's, a similar direction of just making stuff food. And a lot of times it works the same way, especially when you have artifact creatures. Though running something like a Mycosynth Lattice where you make all of your permanents artifacts, then, of course, all your permanents food, you get a lot more value off of that sort of stuff if you want to. I'm not running Mycosynth Lattice in here mostly because that's, I think, too much of a combo enabler, and again, not the crazy amount of the direction I wanted to go with this. I think more focusing on like Boros Food, I think, is a more interesting mechanic, though. I think with Apothecary White, if you do run a Mycosynth Lattice, you're basically doubling the number of food you control whenever you tap them, because you tap the food, you create 1/1 night humans. If those, have Mycosynth Lattice, they're artifacts as well, so you can then every single turn sort of just double the number of humans you control. So that's kind of a cool thing there. Astrid Peth from the Doctor Who precons, 2-mana 2/2, whenever it enters or attacks, creates a food, and whenever you sack a clue or food, it explores. So that's kind of the little extra thing there. I think it's kind of nice to have the food creation on it, though honestly more of the sack effect I think is more important, because that's very much the main part of the deck that we're built around. It's nice to have the food and that sort of thing, but this deck more so than just food itself, because we can sacrifice, our commander is a sacrifice outlet for any artifact. We are focused on sort of the graveyard reanimation sort of thing as more of a main archetype. It's kind of the other big thing with the deck. So having some sort of payoff for a sacrifice is a really nice thing with this, and explores a fairly good mechanic for what it's worth. One of the better ones, probably very much up there in terms of our token creation, is Illustrious Wanderglyph. It's a 5-mana 2/2, has Ascend, so as long as you have 10 or more permanents, you get the City's Blessing, and other artifact creatures you control get +2/+2 as long as you have the City's Blessing, so it's a nice little lord effect. But the main thing here is at the beginning of each upkeep, you create a 1/1 colorless gnome artifact creature token. So this is great because, of course, Ragost, if you're getting life every single turn, he's untapping at each end step. It's not just each of your end steps. So if you're able to somehow gain life every time you're doing this, and you're making tokens every single turn, this is every upkeep as well. You could activate Ragost potentially 5 times in a round, during your normal untap step, and then at each end step as well. So having this out is sort of a good way to combo and get more towards the burn thing, which is definitely another way you can sort of build this deck if you have like a Sulfim or a Tor brand that you're trying to just get extra red, combat damage or non-combat damage really, and you can definitely do it that way as well. Very easy sort of way to style it. I like this sort of life gain, life drain effect. Kind of an interesting way to build around both rather than just, the one life gain that, White is always known for. So kind of an interesting there. If you want to go more that direction, though, again, like I said, artifacts, I think is the main thing here. I'm a big fan of artifacts, so we get a lot of cool things we can do with that. Little Apprentice is just another way to continuously get artifact tokens. It has haste and has Lieutenant at the beginning of your combat on your turn. If you control your commander, you create a 1/1 colorless Thopter artifact creature, one with flying, against haste on a turn. So sort of a body that you can immediately go and attack with if you want to, evasive enough with the flying to be able to maybe get in the point of damage and then, stack it later. So just another way to get a little bit of extra value off of that. Your Battle Sphere, so it's a 7-mana artifact creature, 4/7. When it enters, you create 4 1/1 colorless mirror artifact creature tokens. Second line of text doesn't really matter, it's just the one-time ability to create extra, creatures, specifically artifacts that are food. Getting to pay 7 mana, getting a pretty good amount of bodies and getting 5 artifacts out of it is kind of the main thing here. You could do more of this sort of thing where you're just creating a bunch of artifact creature tokens. We're kind of just a pile of random tokens to be able to generate, though I do like the fact that this is also an artifact because, like I said, we're trying to reanimate artifacts from the graveyard. So this, along with like Threefold Thunderhulk, that when it enters or attacks creates, gnome creature tokens that are artifacts. These are more of a sort of cheaty reanimation is what they're here for. These are kind of our biggest targets. Like Wormcoil Engine is another one of them, something that, dies, comes back, that sort of thing that we're able to get multiple uses out of through that. Wormcoil Engine, more of a sack fodder, even though it's a little bit more expensive. These are, of course, just token generators on ETB, which is extremely nice, though Wormcoil by itself is also just a great card. 6/6 with Death Touch and Lifelink is extremely good. Yeah, though mostly these are just sort of our big top end. This is one thing to definitely preface with this deck as well is the fact that we have a very low curve. Most of our stuff does not really reach above 4 mana, and even then it's usually 3 or below, just because we're trying to run a lot of low to the ground stuff, sort of get our stuff out, and, you know, just sort of the way that Commander is going and how fast it is anymore. A lot of stuff to get low to the ground, though honestly, a lot of that is determined by our Commander because it's a 2 mana card. Being able to get stuff out as fast as possible, you know, and trying to not really curve under our Commander, but get it out and sort of have stuff to do immediately is kind of a big deal as well. Ultic Matter Weaver is sort of a fun one from Ixalan that I like to run in decks because I think it's a pretty powerful ability. It's just sort of narrow, so trying to get certain decks to be able to fit the archetype is a little difficult, but it has whenever you cast a creature spell, you choose one, you either create a 1/1 gnome, artifact creature token, or you create a token that's a copy of target artifact token you control. So both of those abilities are extremely good. I like the ability to, if you do start running, a big thing you can do with this deck, if you want to go towards more of like the copy token sort of thing, where you're like, okay, I have my 3-fold Thunderhulk, I'm going to, you know, have some sort of a heat shimmer type of effect where I create a copy of it, and then, you know, you're making copies of things, and, you know, using these sort of effects to keep creating copies of really big artifact creatures, you could totally do that as well. I think that's another like very powerful way to build this deck as well. Though honestly, just the top line text of whenever we cast creature spells to create, you know, more artifacts is really the main thing here. Stridehanger Automaton is sort of an interesting one as well. One that I didn't really notice coming out with the Aether Drift, though a lot of people kind of missed over Aether Drift. Sort of a Thopter tribal card. It says Thopters you control get +1/+1, and if one or more artifact tokens would be created under your control, you create that many plus an additional 1/1 colorless Thopter. So sort of most of the time ends up being a token doubler for what we're doing, and that's another thing you could definitely add in here. You know, we're in white, so we have the ability to run a few of the token doublers. We keep getting more with each set, it seems like, so that's another really big thing you could definitely do here. Though I like with this, not only of course it's an artifact creature, so it's its own sacked fodder, though, you know, it's a little bit lower mana cost, a little bit easier to cast with 3 generic instead of, you know, whatever white piss would be required for a lot of those cards. And, you know, having, you know, basically whenever it creates stuff, it's creating 2/2s with flying, a fairly good stat line for what it's worth. So another one, and it's also extremely cheap to pick up comparatively to a lot of the other token doublers. That's also, you know, a thing you might include. You know, we're not a budget deck by any means. I would consider anything, though, under like $500 for the most part for a commander deck. On the cheaper end of things, that's just kind of how things have ended up going, though. Definitely if you take out just a few of the more top end cards, you could probably get this under 200. I think this one is a very easy one to build, fairly budget friendly, just because of the way that a lot of this stuff works anymore, and, you know, with land bases and that sort of thing have gotten a lot cheaper, so that's a lot easier to build as well. We just have so much synergy with artifacts that you can still run some of the more, you know, crappy ones or not slightly less efficient ones, I would say, and still have a fairly strong put together deck. Then we also got Toggle here, kind of an interesting one. It's basically got landfall. Whenever land enters, you create a colorless equipment that's an artifact. So that's all that really matters. Every single time that we have a land enter, we get to make artifact tokens that we can sack to stuff. There's a few different things you can do with Toggle. He's kind of an interesting one. So I think there's just kind of a fun little extra thing here. A very easy way to trigger this. You know, we're almost always going to be playing land every turn, and we are also in white that somehow, you know, sometimes has a bit of extra ramp effect as well. So there can be some more lines towards that direction where you could be making a lot of tokens in the same turn. For board wipes, we just have the 2, you know, just sort of the necessary includes our staple. So Blasphemous Act and Farewell. Blasphemous Act is nice because most of the time you're only casting it for 1 red mana. So just very efficient on that front. And then Farewell, mostly the fact that it's an exile type of effect and it hits a lot of different zones, and it's modal, so you can kind of cookie cutter your way around. You're like, okay, I don't have a whole lot of creatures that I really care about. I do have to say the only kind of hard thing with this is the fact that we have, you know, a lot of double type stuff with our artifact creatures. So you're going to be hitting a lot of your stuff a good amount of the time, though, you know, it's a board wipe. You still end up sacrificing some stuff. So just have that modality is still a nice thing to have around. With card advantage, we have a good amount of stuff here. You know, red has a lot of good impulse draw, and we have, you know, some little interesting extra things for the specific archetype we're running. So one of my favorites here is Brass's Tunnel Grinder. It's a 3-mana legendary artifact that when it enters, you can discard any number of cards, and when you do, you draw that many +1, so it's straight up card advantage. A big thing here is we do like discard effects, so like our Thrill of Possibilities and that sort of thing, or even like Demand Answers being able to discard cards, or Faithless Looting even, the ability to put cards into the graveyard. You know, we're a graveyard deck, and so being like, okay, I'm going to put this, you know, Mirror Battlefield in the graveyard, so I have some sort of a way to ready it back or something like that, or Goblin Welder, to kind of bring it back from the battlefield from the graveyard. You know, any graveyard deck, most of the time, you want to, for a powerful version of a graveyard deck, and what a graveyard deck should really be trying to do is using the graveyard as a second hand. You want access to that at pretty much any time you can. truly make sure you're getting the extra power off of that and being in part of that archetype. Also, Bress's Tunnel Grinder has the ability, if you've descended on your turn, you put a board counter on it. So if a permanent card has gone into the graveyard, which of course the discard sort of affects, it triggers itself, and then we have a lot of other ways to do that. We can transform it after it gets 3 of those counters, and then it becomes a land that whenever you cast a permanent spell using mana it produced, it discovers X, where X is that spell's mana value. So just an extra thing at the end, sort of like a Planeswalker Ultimate. That most of the time that's not what you're ending up getting to, just because it takes so many turns to do so. Though if you end up getting to that, that's a pretty powerful effect. Also, we're running a bunch of token stuff, and we're in white, so we have Caretaker's Talent. So whenever one of our tokens enter the battlefield under our control, we draw a card, and then only triggers once each turn. You can also pay a white to level it up. When it becomes level 2, you create a copy of target token you control. So just another way to not only create an additional token of whatever you have, but also it triggers itself because it's creating a token, so you get also a card draw off of that for 1 mana, so that's kind of nice. And then sort of at the end, if you end up having a good amount of like gnome creatures or whatever, you have your mirrors, you can pay for to have creature tokens you control get +2/+2, sort of an anthem effect on the end. I like this card. It's very well rounded, I think, is the biggest thing of and being in white, the card draw is such a big thing there. Although it gives us, the card draw, it gives us the token creation, and it gives us sort of an end game win con type of effect if we really need it. So having all 3 of those, I think, is pretty good for what we're doing. Circuit Mender, kind of a little weirder one. I think this is more of the type of effect they're going to be running in your budget versions of this deck. So it's a 3-mana artifact creature that when it enters, you gain 2 life, and when it leaves, you draw a card. So, of course, the big thing, this is sort of our main archetype here and what we're built around. So its enter effect, like Ichor Wellspring, is kind of, I think, the main example, really. When it enters, we're just put into a graveyard. From the battlefield, you draw a card. So when it enters, it's an artifact you have around it. It does some sort of ETB ability, and then sort of its death trigger, sack trigger with Ragost, either by sacrificing as the food or just with his ability to deal damage. We're putting in the graveyard and getting additional value off of that. So any sort of artifact that we get value off of it going to the graveyard is sort of a really big for the deck, because that's sort of making sure that we get as much advantage out of every part of that. And that's definitely a large thing for how I build a lot of these decks, is trying to make sure that every single line of text you're sort of exploiting as much as you can. So it's like, okay, we want our artifacts to be food, so we have a lot of food synergy. They are artifacts, so they have other artifact synergy. We're sacrificing artifacts. We want stuff that cares about going to the graveyard, and then untaps even as a thing as well. He's untapping himself, so some life gain stuff, not only off of food, but just in general, artifacts have a lot of life gain properties. And then, even other untappers, we got some of that in here. That's definitely a thing you can add in here as well, is the ability to just untap him multiple times in a turn to be able to just deal a whole bunch of damage at once. So just making sure we're hitting every aspect of the commander, kind of playing into all of its strengths. We also have, like I said, a few of these sort of tormenting voice effects. Thrill Possibility, just being instant speed, is kind of nice. So I like Demand Answers specifically because you can also choose to, as an additional cost, sacrifice an artifact, which again is a huge upside for the deck. So just kind of another way to do that and get the card draw. And if we're sacrificing an artifact, we're actually up a card rather than just being net neutral with like a Thrill Possibility. Faithless Looting, it's great just because it's 1 mana, being able to sculpt the hand, and the flashback, of course. If we end up discarding it to some other effect, we get it back for later. One of those things that just, plays in that ability of being able to access your graveyard at all times. We got some of the impulse draws just because I think they're extremely good, especially the newer impulse draws where it's not the same turn impulse, it's next turn impulse. So they just say you may play whatever exile cards to the end of your next turn. So if you end up hitting 2 lands, you still get the ability to play those on both of your turns and not really have too much punishment for trying to play off the top of your deck and kind of getting the random spin. So that's kind of nice there. We got one of our first game changers up with Jessica's Will. Really the thing here is being able to impulse draw the top 3 of your library, though that by itself for 3 mana wouldn't be too great. It's also, the combination of getting the mana off of an opponent's hand. Usually you're getting, paying 3 mana, getting like 7 or 6 red mana, and then you're getting the top 3 cards of your library. So all that together is kind of what makes this the game changer and the really good card that it is. Then Valakut Awakening, I like this because it's MDFC, just kind of a good card to be able to have both sides of that and count as a land, so we can kind of have a slightly lower land count, but though still have all of our spells. And the front is also extremely good whenever you may put any number of cards from your hand on the bottom of your library and draw that many +1. So it's basically just a wheel effect, the same as Brass's Tunnel Grinder, though I still like Brass's Tunnel Grinder a little bit more because it's discard. We do want to put the cards into our graveyard, though, at any time that you would be like, okay, I don't want to discard these cards, as some instant sources, maybe you have a few other these effects that you're like, these don't really do anything in my graveyard. Valakut Awakening can be good and kind of nice for that to, or maybe you have, not a lot of cards left in the deck. You're like, okay, I want to make sure I'm not just throwing all these away. Be able to shuffle them back in is kind of can be an upside depending on what you're doing. And then we get to the combo here. So the combo is very convoluted. I've kind of already hinted at it before with a nuclear vending machine. So with Ragost out, whenever you sack a food, you're creating a treasure food. So if you have some sort of sacrifice outlet for artifacts, one that can be mana neutral, so you're not paying any extra mana into it to keep activating it. The best way to do this is something like a Krark-Clan Ironworks, where you're just able to sacrifice it for free. Though within this deck we have Osgear, so Osgear says you can pay one, sacrifice an artifact, target creature you control gets +2/+0 till end turn. And Crime Novelist says whenever you sacrifice an artifact, it gets a +1/+1 counter and you add a red. So the way to start this is you have these 3 cards and plus Ragost on the battlefield. You either create a token through nuclear vending machine or have some sort of artifact already on the battlefield. You sacrifice whatever food token to Osgear's ability, having that 1 mana. That immediately gives you back a tapped treasure token, and it gives you your mana back. So you're staying at the same exact point, except the biggest upside here is every time you go through this iteration, Crime Novelist puts another counter on itself, and then you give +2/+0 to a target creature till end of turn. So just that by itself means that you're sacrificing an infinite number of food. So if you have any sort of thing that's like ETB or LTB of artifacts, like a Reckless Fireweaver, that ends up just dealing infinite damage. Though just through this, you're getting an infinitely big Crime Novelist, and you're giving your whole board plus X infinite +0 till end of turn as well. So that by itself can end up just being a win condition. Though, like I said, this is a 4-card combo at the very least to kind of get online, just because you need the ability to pay the mana and get the mana back. Though again, there's a few cards you could add in here to make it so you just need the 3-card combo, or maybe 2-card combo depending on what you put in. Though I just thought this was kind of interesting to point out within the deck in case this is the sort of thing you wanted to try out. But the biggest thing in here, of course, besides the food and just artifacts in general, we have the graveyard shenanigans. So a lot of these effects that allow us to play or like swap cards in graveyards, the Goblin Welder effects, where you can choose an artifact in a graveyard, and the artifact you control, you sacrifice the artifact you control and return the one from the graveyard to the battlefield. So that's a lot of what these do, just sort of the effect that's really good for red. Duretti does it, so you can sacrifice an artifact as its down tick if you do return target artifact from your graveyard to the battlefield. Duretti also has a uptick as a Faithless Looting, which is kind of nice, and he has an emblem. Ultimate, if you end up getting to that whenever an artifact is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, return that card at the beginning to the battlefield at the beginning of the next end step. So you can do that. I almost never look at ultimates like that because it's too expensive to try to really build around. Though honestly, just having the sort of repeatable card advantage or card selection engine on top of the repeatable Goblin Welder is usually good enough. Goblin Engineer is basically the same thing as Goblin Welder. It's a little more limited because you do have to pay a red and then tap it and sacrifice the artifact. You can only grab something with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard, so it's not a straight up cheat effect. It's an extra mana, though, of course, the biggest thing with Goblin Engineer, especially if you can use it in conjunction with some sort of other effect, is the fact that it's a tutor. When it enters, you just basically entomb an artifact to your graveyard, so that by itself is pretty good on its own, though, of course, having the full package, even if you are grabbing like an Ichor Wellspring, again, after sacrificing, a prize statue or some sort of way you're getting, the sack and then the ETB, that can be good enough even with the 3 mana value restriction. Like I said earlier, we have a very low curve. Most of our stuff is at that point or below, so we're able to hit a lot of things. Same thing with Savine's Reclamation. Same thing, just returning target permanent with mana value 3 or less from our graveyard to the battlefield, and then if you flash it back, you get that twice. So multiple things with Savine's Reclamation, particularly. Not only is it nice to just have that effect, same thing as Goblin Engineer. Though not having to pay the cost of sacrificing something, of course, is a big upside. And then the fact that just like our Faithless Looting, being able to play this from the graveyard, even if we end up discarding it or milling it, whatever, as an upside to just, again, have sort of that extra hand in the graveyard is nice as well. Edgar is sort of a new one, a really great include. It says, once during each of your turns, you may play an artifact from your graveyard. If you cast a spell this way, that artifact enters tapped, so that's awesome. Just a way to, with anything, sort of a non-conditional, more, I would say, honest way of playing these artifacts, because you do have to pay the full mana cost. You're not cheating anything, though there's no restriction of having to pay the additional cost to, sacrifice anything as well. So just, again, being able to play Ichor Wellspring from the graveyard, have it enter, draw a card, and then be able to sack it with like Ragost's ability, get another card, and then deal the damage. That by itself is a good enough value engine. Most of the time you're getting a bunch of card, and you're kind of doing the thing that you're trying to do. We have a lot of other sack fodder in here. So we have, Mirror Retriever and Junk Diver, sort of another pseudo combo. Again, this is another easy one to make a combo out of if you really want to. That when they die, they return another artifact from your graveyard to your hand. So there is a way that if you just keep paying mana over and over again, you could just sacrifice these back to each other. So if you are running, some cost reducers and then some way to, like a KCI that can generate you mana off the sacrifice, that's another thing you can do. Though just for this deck, these are just sort of generically good cards for what we're doing. Price statue is nice. It's sort of just a ETB, or hit the graveyard, you get a treasure token, so sort of ramp. Scrap trawler is one of our better ones in here as well. Whenever it or another artifact is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, you return to your hand target artifact card with lesser mana cost from a graveyard to your hand. So if we have our junkyard hit the graveyard for the whatever thing, we can get something back with its ability. And then also it's a 3 CMC, so we could grab a 2, 1, or 0 CMC from our graveyard as well. So one of the better value engines, just because it's repeatable. You don't need to sacrifice it. It's just sort of another effect that on top of whatever else we're doing, it gives us that additional value, which is cool. Sir Ginger, the meal ender. So this by itself is kind of nice. It's just a food. So if you don't have Ragost out, it still has all the food synergy. Whenever another artifact you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, so of course the thing that we're doing here, it gets a +1/+1 counter, and you scry 1. So this is basically sort of just the same thing that we're doing up here with Astrid Peth, though instead of exploring, we're just getting to scry, which can be a lot of times better, depending on what you're ending up doing, just because you can manipulate stuff more. If it's a land, it doesn't immediately go to hand. Though honestly, the biggest thing with this, I like that ability. It's nice that it gets really big over time, though it also has sort of a superfood activation where you can pay 2, tap, sacrifice it to gain life equal to its power, rather than just the normal 2 life you would get. So having a sec outlet on the creature itself is kind of nice, though just getting that extra value, like I said, is more the main thing here. We've also got down here sort of just a Goblin Welder on a stick with Trash for Treasure. You as an additional cost, you sacrifice an artifact, return an artifact from graveyard to the battlefield. So kind of a one-time thing there. And then like Ugin's Nexus. This one can go a lot of different ways. And if you're building more towards the artifact copy sort of style of the deck, this kind of can get out of hand very fast. So Ugin's Nexus is a legendary artifact that says if a player would begin an extra turn, that player skips that extra turn instead. But if it would be put into a graveyard from the battlefield, instead exile it and take an extra turn after this one. So the big thing here is the fact that, it's sort of an oxymoron in and of itself, that when it's on the battlefield you can't take extra turns, but when it leaves in the battlefield you get an extra turn. And so the way to sort of break this card is when you kind of look at that type line of it being a legendary artifact. So if you have like a sculpting steel or some sort of way to copy this artifact, you would get an additional copy of it. That legend rolls away because the copy is legendary. You have to pick one stays, one goes. The one that goes as it hits the graveyard is still Ugin's Nexus, so it triggers its second ability of being put into the graveyard to give you an extra turn. Though, of course, if you try to start that extra turn, the original Ugin's Nexus would just skip it. So that by itself is not enough. What you need to do after that, because this is not an effect that immediately goes off, you have to try to start your extra turn before it would, the stacks piece of it would actually activate. If you have some other way, like with Ragost, to sacrifice the original Ugin's Nexus, you can actually take 2 extra turns, because, you get the original trigger, that trigger, and then there's no more stacks piece left. So I think that's sort of a very, very powerful way to play this card if you're doing it that way. We do run like 1 or 2 copy effects in the deck, though honestly just being able to play this on the battlefield as a stacks piece if you need it, and then be able to sacrifice it whenever you need to get an extra turn, especially because we have a sack out in the command zone, I think makes us a really powerful card. We've already kind of talked about Osgir a little bit within the deck, though its second ability is really nice. You can pay X, tap it, exile a target artifact with a mana value X from your graveyard. You create 2 copies you create 2 tokens that are copies of the exiled card. So this is a good way to do that with Ugin's Nexus. If you can get this into the graveyard without having it be on the battlefield, you can, use Osgir's ability, immediately get that ability, the 2 of them, and then even Osgir himself can sacrifice that to his first ability as well if you wanted to. So I think I like Osgir is just another way to be like, okay, you get a one-time doubling effect. The only bad part of it is it does exile the card from the graveyard, though I think besides that, just getting a one-time, like, okay, I need a little bit of extra mana for the turn. I'm going to, bring this out, sacrifice them a few times to get the extra treasure tokens, or, what have you. There's a lot of different ways I think that having those 2 tokens ends up being extremely worth it. For interaction, we don't have a crazy amount of interaction. I think this is a fair amount, kind of just the staples, of course, anything that's kind of our targeted removal. We got our Swords to Plowshares, our Path to Exile, Generous Gift, Chaos Warp, kind of our normal sort of standard package. We also got Boros Charm, mainly here. It's got a bunch of different modes, but the one we care about is we can give our opponents an indestructible tonal turn, so sort of a half heroic intervention. Reprieve, I love this card. I think it's just basically a white counter spell. You sort of have to play correctly as sort of a tempo card, where you're like, okay, say my opponent, has 6 mana up, they pay 5 of that to cast a Wrath of God. I'm going to play this now because they can't immediately recast it. It sort of, gets them off a turn, and, they have a Wrath of God in hand. I like this cantrips as well, and a big thing to look at with this card specifically is it returns to the owner's hand. It does not counter the spell. So if someone plays like a Last March at the end that says the spell's uncounterable, you can still return that card to its owner's hand. It's not being countered, it's just being returned. So that's another sort of weird thing that a lot of times it can be better than a straight up counter spell. Dispatch is sort of an interesting one here. It normally just taps a target creature for 1 mana, though if you have Metalcraft, so if you control at least 3 artifacts, it exiles that creature. It's just sort of an unconditional, or a conditional, unconditional, no back end upswing for the opponent to exile a target creature. So that's kind of nice. One of our other game changers here is Teferi's Protection. Sort of just our end all be all of, hey, I'm gonna step out of the game for a turn just to make sure that I get to stay around a little bit more. And if played at the right time, this basically can kind of just give you the game, which of course is why it's a game changer, a very big card that changes the game. Though I think honestly one of the more expensive cards for the deck, but very much worth running in just because it's such a powerful effect to have and to kind of change the tide of battle if you end up being on sort of the losing side. And lastly here we've Sheltered by Ghosts, and so this is sort of a way to really synergize with the commander. So when it enters, you exile target non-land permanent an opponent controls until it leaves the battlefield, so sort of a O-ring type of effect. But the main thing, honestly, that's kind of a nice additional effect, but we really care about giving the creature lifelink and ward. So ward, just good to have the protection, but the lifelink, because with Ragost specifically, with its second ability to deal 3 damage to each opponent, it itself is doing the damage, and so lifelink does track that. So whenever you do that, if you give Ragost lifelink, it deals 3 damage to everyone, you gain 9 life, and then it triggers itself because you gain life to untap itself. So if you can give Ragost lifelink, I think that's really where you're getting to sort of the turbo damage point of the game, and turbo life gain. Really, you're dealing 3 damage to each opponent, but you're gaining that much life back, which is kind of the big thing here. Give it some sort of things, a Johnny's Primate type of effects where you're just getting a bunch of life. If you can put that on him, you can do Voltron, I think, very easily with this commander as well. So just being able to untap itself with its own ability, I think is really big, and definitely a thing that I would recommend having a few of, at the very least in here, of the lifelink type of giving effects. For lands, we are running 34, 35 with our MDFC. Like I said, we don't need a whole lot in here. I think it's still, a fair amount of lands to run because we are running, a good amount of ramp. We are, in artifact decks, we have Mana Rock, but we also have, a very low mana curve that we don't need a whole lot of this stuff anyway. And this is definitely a pricier sort of mana base. It looks a little bit more spending than it really is just because we have a lot of lands that up until recently have been extremely expensive. Like the filter lands I remember being fairly expensive for a while. I don't think Sunbaked Canyon had a reprint for multiple years until the pre-con that it was put in with this. Though honestly, mostly because of a lot of our typings mattering, especially with a lot of these cards, like the reveal lands care about having land types, Clift Arbor Tree cares about having land types, that sort of thing. Our Verges care about having land types. It's nice to have a lot of the more expensive lands with like our Shockland or Surveillant and our Fetch land, though honestly, I don't even think that's always important, especially if you're running a good on a basic. So we're running, a dozen of them. So most of the time you're still turning on these cards, though what really I think puts it over the edge as being worth running in here is the Elegant Parlor. Having a Surveillant in a graveyard deck just, kind of turns the power up to 11. So it's just a lot more synergistic within the deck and a lot more useful because we do care about what we're putting in the graveyard. So not only are we getting rid of cards that we don't want in our deck, they're put into the graveyard for later as a resource. So that's kind of a big thing there. And of course, we're turning all artifacts, whether they're creatures or not, into food. And so running artifact lands is also very nice. So running both of our colored ones with Ancient Den and Great Furnace. We've got a Darksteel Citadel. We have our indestructible one, the Modern Horizons land with Restvale Bridge, and then, Treasure Vault as sort of rounding out the curve there. So that's kind of nice. Treasure Vault specifically is also cool because it makes treasure tokens. Ability that's sometimes relevant within decks that run Treasure Vault, sometimes not, though I think with this deck it can't end up being, if you can pour a good amount of mana into it, be sort of a good amount of effect for what we're doing. Not only because, having the bit of extra sort of weird sort of mana dump ramp is kind of nice, and we're creating artifact tokens, and then of course if you have, like our Canning Mini Factor, that effect becomes extremely good. We've also got like Witch's Clinic is another way to give our commander lifelink until end of turn. It's only until end of turn. It's not a static effect, so you're only able to untap your commander once with it, though, paying the 2 and then the extra to tap Witch's Clinic. So basically 3 mana to give it lifelink to not only untap itself till end of turn, you're basically, if you're doing 2 activations in that turn, you're getting 6 damage on each opponent, and then you're getting 18 life, which I think is worth the 3 extra mana that you'd have to pay for that one turn. We've got Spirit of Industry, just sort of a City of Brass for our deck. You pay 1 life, add 1 of any color, only activate only if you control an artifact. You could run a Glimmer Void in here if you wanted to, because we just do have a lot of ways to have artifacts. We've got, a lot of good generic lands. A lot of it is, our Exotic Orchards or our stables here, Command Tower, that sort of thing. Monumental Hedge is kind of cool. Enter step unless you control planes, but you can pay 4, tap it, look at the top 5 cards of your library. You may reveal a historic card from among them and put it into your hand, put those on the bottom. So kind of just a card advantage engine on top of that. So of course, historic spells are artifacts, legendaries, and sagas. Mostly with this deck, we care about hitting the artifacts, whether it be land or, some sort of mana rock, whatever. Just having that additional ability on a land to be able to generate value is a pretty big deal. I think sort of, besides like Buried Ruin as being able to get some of our artifacts from the graveyard, I think our sort of cherry on top of all this is the Inventor's Fair. So it's kind of cool that it came out, Edge of Eternity sort of fits the theme here, though I'm glad it kind of shot down in price, having a reprint after quite a long time, though it is one of our tutors. So it's got Metalcraft. Basically, if you control 3 or more artifacts at the beginning of your upkeep, you gain 1 life. Doesn't really matter. Though if you control 3 or more artifacts, you can activate its second ability where you can pay 4, sacrifice it to tutor any artifact into your hand. So that's kind of the big thing here, get one of our, especially if you're going towards the more efficient combo route, having the artifact tutor is a pretty big deal to grab. Your Academy Manufacturer, vending machine or whatever. Having that sort of thing on the land is just extremely good. I think even for this deck, running like an Urza Saga, if you want to kind of dump in that little bit of extra money into it to have that card, I think again is just an extremely good one for running. Shadow Spear is another one. Like if you want the lifelink and trample, I think that's a very good include as well. A lot of different things you can add to this, depending. A lot of it here, and a lot of for this deck specifically, the way I've built it is sort of a demonstration of all the different archetypes, because of course you can do a lot with it. So kind of you can very much pivot into a very specific direction if you feel like I want to do only food, or I want to do more of the combo thing, or I want to focus even more on graveyard. There's definitely ways to focus on those specifically if you want to. Though I think overall we're kind of getting a good amount of each piece of the pie with it. In terms of ramp, we've kind of seen a little bit of already. We got a price statue, creates treasure tokens. Justice Will makes us mana. Prime Novice, whenever we sack artifacts, we get red mana, so that's kind of nice in terms of, sacking our food. Ragost sacking stuff also generates mana, and then, our treasures, basically, they sacrifice themselves for mana, and then we get additional mana on top of that. So there's that. Got a lot of our stables here with Arcane Signet, Soul Ring, our Talisman or Felwar Stone. Also kind of staply for artifact decks, how our mana reducers with Foundry Inspector and Cloud Key. Cloud Key, of course, being sort of the better one, not only because it's not a creature, so it's doesn't die to as much removal, and you can choose different types. Though most of the time we're running so many artifacts that you're going to be choosing artifact anyway. But again, just having some sort of these redundant effects, you can run more like Seventh Anvil and that sort of thing as well. Though I think this is good enough. We have a fairly good amount of ramp, and again, our curve is fairly low, so you don't need it all. But if you want to just crap out a lot of these artifacts for basically free, having these mana reducers is also very good. Inspiring Statuary, like it gives our non-artifact spells we cast improvise, so we can tap artifacts, kind of like mana, sort of an artifact convoke, to be able to cast our non-artifact spells. So that's kind of cool. Turning all of our food tokens into tappable treasures pretty much is really nice. And sort of a specific one in here that like a Mycosynth Lattice effect is Liquid Metal Torque. So it's just a mana rock in itself, but you can also have target non-land permanent become an artifact in addition to its other types still on a turn. So this is a way to be like, okay, I have something on my battlefield that I want to be able to sacrifice, or I want the artifact to, have it be an artifact for other specific synergies. You can totally do that with Liquid Metal Torque, and I like that sort of thing. Running like a Liquid Metal Coating might not be too bad. Again, if you're going more towards of the specific synergy combo lines, I think that's definitely an effect you want to have in here. And lastly, we have our value categories, so just sort of our regular sort of weird stuff. So we have Basilisk Collar, again, just another way to get lifelink very easily. Some of our tappers with Sting. So Sting is nice because it not only gives our commander haste, so if we can immediately play it out, immediately equip it, we can immediately start tapping it that same turn. Because I do think Ragost is going to become a commander because it has so much value and is such a mainstay of the deck, because it's what turns all of our artifacts into food. It's going to be pretty remove on site, so having stuff like this to give it haste is fairly nice for what we're doing. And the fact that it also, at the beginning of each combat, it untaps our commander, so sort of the half Seaborn Muse effect is sort of the two big ones with this. I think it kind of just gives us all the different things we need, sort of kind of speeds up our game plan, speeds up the clock on our opponents. Sort of similar here is Drum Bellower, same thing. It just untaps all creatures we control instead of during the combat, during each player's untap step. So a little bit better in a lot of ways, just because it's a universal effect for all of our creatures rather than just one. We're paying technically less mana for it because we don't have to equip the thing, and it's each creature. That's kind of, I think, the biggest thing with this is having be able to swing out with our board and kind of getting them pseudo vigilance can be pretty nice for what we're doing. Lightning Greaves, just another way to protect our commander, generically good card there. Talks about Sculpting Steel, we can just have it enter as a copy of any artifact on the battlefield, so to just get an extra copy of like, okay, I want an extra price statue for whatever reason. I want to, reduce my stuff with a cloud key. There's a lot of application that Sculpting Steel has. And, if someone else, this is any artifact on the battlefield, not just your battlefield. So if someone else has like a One Ring or whatever, they have something you really want to copy, you can also do that with this, which I think is also really nice. I like Arbaz Mir with this deck because he says whenever he or another non-token historic permanent enters the battlefield under your control, it deals 1 damage to each opponent and you gain 1 life. So this is sort of the in-between of the life, group slug where you're dealing damage to people, but it also gives you the life gain, which I think is kind of the biggest upside with this card. So whenever we're having our artifacts enter the battlefield, we're getting the life gain off of it, so it triggers Ragost. So that's really cool if somehow on each of your each turn you're able to activate Arbaz Mir in some sort of way or get him to trigger. Being able to get that, just 1 point of life gain is all you need to be able to have Ragost on tap. So I think that's kind of an extra little nice thing. Though those little bits of damage do end up adding up over time. If anything, like Impact Tremors has something to say about it, it's very much an effect that you see over the course of a game. Lastly here for a game changer is Enlightened Tutor. So of course, it's extremely good for our deck. Search the library for an artifact or enchantment, reveal it to and put on the top of your library. So, it's the 1 mana, get what we need at the time. That might be an Aetherflux Reservoir, something really big that we can be like, okay, I need this energy piece right now. Again, this is something that you go towards more of the top end. I think just running even a few tutors can always be nice, especially if you are running lower power or, stuff that is a little more generable. You kind of have to assemble a Root Goldberg machine of cards to have your deck work right. I don't think it's a bad idea to run a few extra tutors. Like Gamble is another one I think would be really good for this deck, just because if we do end up discarding cards, most of the time we don't care anyway. Just being able to tutor an Entomb for this deck is also an extremely good card. And of course, having the non-conditional Demonic Tutor for 1 red mana is also a very good rate. And speaking of Aetherflux, that's just an insane card, especially if you're going towards more of the life gain route. So whenever we cast a spell, you gain 1 life for each spell you've cast this turn, so sort of a life gain storm. And then the big payoff here is you can pay 50 life and have to deal 50 damage to target creature or player. So that if we're gaining some life off of, having our commander deal damage every single turn, or if we're just, casting a lot of our low drop spells in a turn to be able to get a bunch of extra life off of that, or sacking food, whatever have you, this is a good way to just be like, okay, I'm going to end the game, or just, take someone out and have a sort of win condition for that. Of course, you don't really want to keep Aetherflux Reservoir out on the battlefield for too long because it is an extremely kill on sight card, because everyone knows that once this comes down, it's only going to really be a turn or two until someone ends up dead. And even if you don't get to activate that, just getting life gain, it's so efficient in the way that it gives you life that by itself would be, enough to pad out your life total and make it hard to kill you. So I think any way this card ends up coming out, I really wouldn't play it until you're ready to win the turn. Same thing with a lot of these other cards, a lot of our combo stuff. You want to make sure that you have a good amount of time to use that card on that turn, enough resources to make advantage of it, because you never know when that card's going to end up, leaving the battlefield for whatever reason. And then on here, we do have another tutor here, sort of our artifact birthing pod with Oswald Finnerbender. So he has magical tinkering. You can pay a white, tap it, sacrifice an artifact, search your library for an artifact with mana value equal to 1 plus the sacrifice artifact's mana value put on the battlefield. So, if you sacrifice a Sculpting Steel, if that's still a 3 CMC thing that it's copying, you can get a 4 CMC, and then a 5 CMC, and then, so on. We're not super built around this. A lot of birthing pod sort of decks want to have, a step ladder sort of mana curve, so you always have something to tutor out, though most of the time we're running a good amount of 2s and 3s, and we have some 4s, where most of the time you're getting a few activations off of this. Especially, I think the 2 to 3 sort of jump is the biggest one for this deck, just because there are, artifacts for the deck. 3 is kind of the sweet spot. A lot of our better ones, though. Even something like, getting a price statue or some sort of thing off of a 1-drop or a 2-drop, and being able to sacrifice them, of course, is another upside. Being able to get whatever their triggers are on top of getting to tutor a new thing. Just kind of all over the place. Getting, again, the value off of every single part of the deck, I think, is the big thing here. But yeah, that is our Ragost deck. So kind of an interesting one. I really do like when Wizards sort of explores not quite new archetypes, but putting new archetypes in new categories. I know sort of the color pie, not as much anymore, but it was kind of a sacred thing where you're like, oh, they can, colors can only do this thing or that thing. And so sometimes seeing weird stuff like this branch out to, you're like, okay, we're going to give you something new to play with in a different way, kind of put a twist on things, I think is fun. And kind of one of the more interesting ones to me to build around are these sort of archetypes. You're like, hey, play with the same sort of toys, but play with them in a new way, put them in a new scenario. That sort of thing I think is a really interesting thing here. But like I said, you can always kind of shift things around if you want to pivot in towards, I think this deck could very much benefit from going towards more of the burn life gain sort of strategy if you're going for that rather than just straight up artifacts. We've shown a few things like Etherflux Reservoir, just having lifelink in general is a very powerful effect for the deck, especially because our commander has the life gain trigger. Or just in general, having more untappers, just making sure that you're able to tap him over and over and over again. That by itself would be an extremely good thing. Or, damage triplers, doublers, whatever. That could also, if you're getting triple damage off of him where you're doing 9 damage to everyone and you have lifelink where you're getting 27 life, it just get, the sky's the limit when you get to that point. But I just think that I do like the ability to kind of choose your path with this commander, especially because sometimes, a lot of these commanders can be sort of pigeonholed into one thing. Like if you're playing Tatiova deck, you're playing, with Simic Landfall. That's all you can really do with that commander, though. Here we have, for one, a lot of it has to do with how many lines of text cards have anymore. This has 3 separate abilities, so that's definitely a big thing. It's got a static ability, an activate ability, and a triggered ability, which I don't know if that's like a bingo, but it kind of feels like it should be. So that definitely plays into it, just the more complexity of cards, though I do think, well, it is, a little bit hard to understand. It can kind of, especially for newer players, sort of make it a little bit harder to get into these sort of commanders. I think on the backside, sort of the upside of it is the fact that we get to explore new avenues for things, and we have more of a flexibility with what we build our commanders around. But yeah, that was the deck. I hope all of you have enjoyed this video. If you want to take a look at the deck list, I will leave a Moxfield link in the description below. And if you want to check out any of the other deck list reviews I've done, I'll also leave a link to that YouTube playlist in the description. But besides all of that, I will see all of you beautiful people in the next one.